Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are coming to the conclusion of Parshat Ha'azinu, and here we go. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe, and the Lord spoke to Moses, be'etzem hayom hazeh, in the midst of this day, right, as it were, in the heat of the day, right, itzumo shel yom, the moment when the day is at its strength, right. Let's take a look. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe be'etzem hayom hazeh. So what's the significance of this particular phrase? So he says, compares three places. Beshlosha makomot, there are three places, ne'emar, where it says be'etzem hayom hazeh, right, where it uses this phrase be'etzem of this day, and to look at the three contexts and see what they have in common. Ne'emar ben Noach, regarding Noah, right back in Genesis chapter 7. Be'etzem hayom hazeh ba Noach. It says, in the etzem of this day, Noah and his family came into the ark, etc. Be'marit oro shel yom. In other words, in broad daylight. Lefi, why? So what's the significance of that? Lefi shahayu b'nei doro, because the people of his generation, they were saying or thinking, bechach bechach, right? They were thinking this such and this and such. Im anu margishim bo, right? This, if we have a sense, ein anu menuchim, if we have a sense that he's going to do this, ein anu menichin oto likanes bateva, we're not going to allow him. We're not going to allow him to enter into the ark. Velo'od, right? And not only that, not only will we prevent him from entering the ark, ela anu notlim kshilin v'kardumot. We are going to take sledgehammers and pickaxes or axes, umavakim, and we're going to break up, we're going to split up et hateva, the ark. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said the Holy One, blessed be He. So, in other words, God thought on the other side. Harini makniso b'chatzi hayom. I'm going to take him into the ark in midday. V'chol mi sheyesh biyado kach, and anyone who has the power, limchot, should try to prevent him. Yavo v'yimche, he should come and prevent him. In other words, it was a clear demonstration of the power of God. That's the significance of the sentence as this be'etzem hayom hazo. And of course, the etzem also has the connotation of the strength, right? It's the strength of God. Another case, b'Mitzrayim, in Egypt, Ne'emar, it says back in Exodus chapter 12. Be'etzem hayom hazeh, in the etzem of this day, Hotzi Hashem, the Lord took them out. In other words, that God took out the Jewish people, the Israelites, from the land of Egypt. Why? Lefi shayu mitzrim umrim, because the Egyptians were saying, bechach bechach, such and such and such, im anu margishim, if we have a sense by him regarding those Israelites, einu manichinotam latzeit, we're not going to allow them. If we have the slightest suspicion that they're going to escape from us, we're not going to allow them to go out, to leave Egypt. And not only that, but we're going to take swords, and other arms, and we're going to kill them. We're going to absolutely prevent them in any shape or form from leaving the land of Egypt. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said the Holy One, blessed be He. Hareini motzian b'chatzi hayom. Indeed, I'm going to take them out in midday. And let anyone who has the strength to prevent me, yavo v'yimchet, let him come and try to prevent this. So how does that apply? Again, we're seeing that this is a demonstration that against human agency, that God's agency is overpowering. So how does that fit this context? Afkan. So here too, V'mitato shel Moshe, when it came to Moses dying, the death of Moses, Ne'emar, it says, Be'etzem hayom hazeh, it says, in the etzem of this day. So how? The reason is, Shahayu Yisrael Umrim, the Israelites were saying, B'chach, if such and such, they were discussing this, right? Im anu margishin bo, if we have the slightest sense, ein anu manichin oto, we're not going to allow him to go up and die. We're not going to allow it to happen. Why is this possible? Adam shehotzianu mimitzrayim, this person, this individual who brought us out of Egypt, v'karan lanu et hayam, and he split the sea, v'horid lanu et haman, and he caused the manna to descend on us, v'higiz lanu et haslav, and he brought the partridges to feed us. And he also caused this well to spring up, right? So we always had an adequate water supply. V'natan lanu et Torah, and he gave us the Torah. Ein anu manichinoto. We're not going to let him. We're not going to let him leave camp. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said the Holy One, blessed be He. Hareini machniso b'chatzi hayom v'chulei. But in fact, I'm going to have him come up. I'm going to cause him to go up to Mount Nebo, and there he's going to die. You're not going to be able to prevent that from happening. So this, of course, raises some other questions, because we know for a fact that people are mortal. The Israelites had to know, maybe they really did believe that given these miracles that Moses performed, that he wasn't going to die possibly, right? Maybe that really is the case, but I have a feeling that, again, from a literary point of view, this is trying to tell us something else. And I must confess, at this point, I haven't completed or been able to satisfy my ruminations about this as to what the point is, and whether or not it's saying that regardless, we need to put our ultimate trust in God, that people don't. People don't necessarily recognize just how everything ultimately is in God's hands, and mortal agency is not going to be able to ultimately overcome whatever it is that God desires to have happen. And that is on a very basic level, and possibly there's a profound lesson there, because given the fact that as human beings, so often we question even God's existence, let alone God's agency, that there's something very powerful being said here regarding these examples where human beings try to prevent something from happening. And also there's an interesting point that if you look at Noah and the Exodus from Egypt, here were human beings trying to prevent God from doing something very, very important, from in fact doing something that ultimately would be life-saving, and take life onto a different kind of level. So the question is here, with the death of Moses, are we talking about something else as well? That there was a future for Moses that human beings weren't able to perceive. That's on one side. On the other side, even the fact that Moses wasn't around anymore meant that it now became dependent on human beings, on other people who perhaps didn't have the level of Moses's prophecy, sense of prophecy, to be able to, that God in a sense was saying, you can do it. If you want to do it badly enough, you can. So just a couple of thoughts regarding this particular interpretation. So going on. Let's find it here. Ale el har ha'avarim. So God is commanding Moses. He says, go up to Har Mount Ha'avarim Hazeh. It's being referred to as the mountain of Avarim, Har Nevo. And now we have the actual name of it, Mount Nevo. Asher be'eretz Moav, which is in the land of Moab. Asher al pnei Yericho, which faces Jericho. Or et Eretz Canaan, and see the land of Canaan, Asher ani noten livnei Israel lachuzah, which I am giving to the children of Israel as a holding. Le'choz means to hold on to something. So I think there's some interesting, again, from a literary point of view, there's some interesting connections here. Moses, of course, married the daughter of a priest of Midian, and Midian and Moab are, I think, pretty close to each other. Remember when we were reading about the story of Bilam, we had these two areas connected. And facing Jericho. Jericho was the very first city that they conquered in the land. That was the first city of conquest in the land of Canaan. And so there may be a sense here of the blessings and the goodness of Moses and as a protecting power of some kind with regards to the future of the Israelites. Let's see if there is any commentary on this. Just check and see. I'm looking carefully. I think we are not going to see it. Okay, 50. Umut and die bahar on the mountain, asher ata ole shama, which you are going up. Ve'asef alamecha, and be gathered to your people. Ka'asher mate Aaron, just as Aaron died, achicha, Aaron your brother died, Behor Hahar, at Mount Hor. V'yasef elamav, and when he was gathered to his people. So it's interesting, even though it mentions death, it also talks about being gathered to his people. And there's something that might be very comforting about the idea that when we move out of this existence that we have in this world, that somehow we're reunited to all our relatives, that we'll be reunited with them. That would be a very comforting thought. So, again, what's the point of this parenthetical statement? You should die just as your brother Aaron died. But otamita, in other words, in the same way in which he died, sheraita, that you saw, v'chamadata ota, and you desired it. You wanted it so badly. Shehivshit Moshe et Aaron, because what happened was that Moses begged, he took off Aaron's clothing, his cloak, Rishon. In other words, he took off his outer cloak, Vehil Bishan Elazar, and he gave them to Elazar. He dressed Elazar, his son, V'chein Sheni, and likewise the second garment, V'chein Shlishi, and likewise the third garment, V'ra'ah b'no bichvodo, and he saw his son in all his splendor. In other words, Aaron saw his son in all his splendor. Amar lo Moshe. So Moses said to him, and before we say that, I want to make the point here that I think what's being said is the ability to pass on whatever it is that we do accomplish that is worthy in our lives onto our children is something that's a great source of comfort to us. And we know that that's the one thing Abraham and Sarah were afraid of because they were childless, that they wouldn't be able to do that. So that's something very significant. So Moses says Aaron achi, Aaron my brother, ale lemita, now go up to your couch, in other words, to your deathbed. Right? Ve'ala, and so he went up, Aaron went up and lay on the couch. Pshot yadecha, Moses said to Aaron, stretch out your hands. Upashat, and so he stretched out his hand. Pshot raglecha, stretch out your legs. Upashat, and so Aaron did all of this, right? Atzum einecha, close your eyes. Va'atzam, and he closed them. Kamotz picha, close your mouth. V'kamatz, and he closed his mouth. V'halachlo, and he went, and then Moses left. In other words, this is a very dignified, mindful, you might say, way of dying. Amar Moshe, Moses said, and again, this word Amar definitely can mean thought, right? Moses thought, Ashrei mi, happy, this word Ashrei, mi shemet b'mitazo, whoever dies in this particular way. This is such an amazing way in which to pass on to the next world, to make that transition. Allah share, and now this is, remember, God is saying this to Moses. He's giving Moses this instruction, and that he is to die at this point. And of course, the whole idea is that he is to die before they start entering the land of Canaan. He never gets to do that. Al Hashem altim bi, because you trespassed against me. And of course, Moses and Aaron were together in that, betoch bnei Israel, in the midst of the children of Israel, b'mei merivat kadesh, regarding the waters of Meribat Kadesh, b'midbar Tzin, in the wilderness of Tzin, Alasher, and in the fact that the way in which they trespassed, Alasher Loki Dashtem Oti, that you did not sanctify me, Betoch Bnei Israel, amongst the children of Israel. Of course, this is a very significant part of this story, that given all that Moses and Aaron did, that this one trespass meant that they could not go into the land of Israel. I'm sure there's a lot more that could be said about that and its significance, but let's take a look at what Rashi has to say. Allah Shem Altambi, in that you trespassed against me. Garamtim limaolbi, right? You caused me to, that is to, in Me'ilah is generally, that's a sin of using sanctified objects in a way that is not sanctified, not treating sanctified objects in a way, in all with the rules that go along with the treatment of and how you handle sanctified objects. So going on a little more specifically, Asher Loki Dashtemotoi. So what do you mean? Because they did not sanctify God. And in what way did they not sanctify God? Garemtem li, you caused me, you caused it to happen for me, shelo et kadesh, that I should not be sanctified. In other words, they did something that prevented people from recognizing the level of sanctity that God possesses. In what way? Amarti lachem, I said to you, God is saying, Amarti lachem, in Numbers chapter 20, v'dibartem elasela, speak to the rock, vehem hikuhu, and they, that is Moses and Aaron, smote the rock, they hit the rock, v'hutzrachu lahakoto palmaim, and because they didn't speak to the rock as God commanded them, they had to strike it twice. In other words, there was a show of strength, of power, right? Physical power. Ve'ilu dibru imo, and had they spoken to it, v'natan meimav, it would have given forth its waters, below hakaha, without any smiting whatsoever. And I'm wondering here, we know that the power of words, right? You might almost say diplomacy as opposed to brute force. And here, such an idea that even speaking to a rock, right? There's a lot of symbolism involved in speaking to a rock. In other words, when you're in talking to someone who is like a rock, in that they are immovable, they don't want to hear what you have to say. And there are times when words have far more power if they're used properly than trying to physically force someone to do something. So obviously, if Moses and Aaron had spoken to the rock, and the rock had poured forth its waters in front of the Israelites, they would have recognized, the Israelites would have recognized how ultimately everything is again, in the hands of the divine. And so it would have given its waters without being struck. Hayam kadesh sham shamayim. Then literally it means the reputation of heaven would have been sanctified. In what way? Shehayu Yisrael Omrim, in that the Israelites would have said, Uma hasela hazeh, if in a case of this rock, she'eno lischar, which doesn't receive reward, the rock is not going to receive any reward. It's not created to receive reward, v'lo leporanut, nor is it to receive punishment. It doesn't. In other words, it doesn't lose or gain from doing anything. Im zakah ein lo matan schar. If in fact it does well, there is no reward for its doing well. acting righteously, v'im chata, and if it sinned, eino luka, it's not going to be punished, right? It's not going to be beaten for having sinned. Kach mekayem mitzvot bor'o. If that is the case, someone who upholds the commandments of his creator, anu lo kol shechen. In other words, if we realize that we are supposed to follow the dictates of God, the commandments of God, and we do, in fact, receive reward or punishment, how much the more so we should do it. In other words, think of the whole situation. Moses and Aaron would be speaking to the rock. The rock was being told to give its waters. It gave its waters, right? And here, here's a rock that has nothing to lose if it doesn't. And how about human beings who have to gain or to lose if they, in fact, follow the commandments of God? So that didn't happen. It couldn't have happened because the Israelites just saw Moses and Aaron just smashed the rock, and there was no sense of the divine and the importance of following the commandments. And of course, when we in fact do follow the commandments, that's a way in which we sanctify the name of heaven. On to the last verse of Hazinu. Ki mineged tireh, but mineged tireh, you will see it from afar, from the opposite side. Et haaretz, the land, you'll see the land from the opposite side. V'shama lo tavo, but there you will not come. El haaretz asher noten livnei Yisrael, that is, you will not come into the land which I am giving to the children of Israel. And we'll see, right? Ki mi neged, right? Opposite. Neged means the opposite. And he says merachok, from a distance. That's how we need to understand from on the opposite side. Tir'eh, you shall see, etc. Ki im lo tir'ena achshav, because if you don't have the opportunity, Moses, to at least see the land now, lo tir'ena od b'chayecha, you will not see it again in your lifetime as a living person. You will not see it again. So the opportunity for Moses to at least see the reality of what the Israelites were to inherit, even though he himself couldn't enter. V'shama lo tavo, but there you shall not come. Ki adati, because I understand. Ki chaviva hilach, because I know how precious it is to you, how delightful it is to you. Al-Kain, and for this reason, Ani Omer Lacha, I'm saying to you, Ale v'ra'eh, go up and see it. At least that much you should be able to do, to actually observe the land of Canaan that will become the land of Israel. And that's the end of Parshat Hazinu for us. And I'm going to stop the share. And I'm so happy to see Harlan and David. Any comments? Thank you. I'm so appreciate your joining us. Any thoughts? Yes, Harlan. Good. Thank you. Yes, I can't hear you, Harlan.
Oh,
okay.
what is a score? Like 4 scores and 10
Score is 20. A score is 20.
20. So we have our life can be up to 3 scores and 10?
Yes, that's an average lifespan, and by reason of strength, 4 score. That's the average lifespan. In other words, our expectations, as far as that's concerned. So, yeah, right. So Moses was actually 120. He lived to 120. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So he was 80 years old when he took the Israelites out of Egypt. Significant. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.